Hello everyone and welcome back to TowerGate for this special afternoon presentation on this Wednesday. As I said in the previous video, Sharyl Attkisson recently wrote a fantastic article which goes back and examines the origins of the Russia-Trump story, the background story, the backdrop that all this is based on, everything that we're talking about on my normal TowerGate videos. But the way that Sharyl Attkisson laid this out is she laid it out in timeline fashion. I am going to provide a link to that story for you. Now I'll tell you it takes about an hour to go through it because she lays it out as a timeline, but it's a story within a timeline. And she goes back to the very origins of this Trump-Russia, where it all came from, all the way back to 2011. So this is kind of complicated. There's a lot here. I'm going to try to give you about a 15 or 20 minute explanation of it to give you the general idea, and if it's interesting to you and you want to go read the entire thing, which I recommend you do, then you can go ahead and click on that link and you can go read it for yourself. But essentially the origins and how this all got started really goes back to the situation that's been happening but was really major issue back in 2011, 2012 in Ukraine. And in fact, the Russia-Trump collusion story has its roots in what was happening in Ukraine. Remember, Ukraine, the situation was they had an election, then the U.S. and the European Union had a putsch because the guy who they won the election was Mr. Yanukovych. Now, Mr. Yanukovych is hated by the United States, the European Union, and the Western world. He was not the guy they wanted to win. They wanted Mr. Yatsenyuk, I think his name was. And if you all remember, WikiLeaks released a bunch of emails, and it caught Victoria F.U. Nuland making plans with one of her subordinates, talking about how they wanted to execute the putsch and then get their boy Yats into that position. Well, they executed the putsch all right, and they got rid of Mr. Yanukovych, and that was done using this group called the Maidan, and they were backed and supported by Soros, and yes, Soros was deeply involved with the U.S. State Department, the European Union, in carrying out this putsch. And the idea was to get rid of Mr. Yanukovych and to get in Mr. Yatsenyuk. But apparently, and I think Yatsenyuk actually did get him in. But since then, there's been another election or another change of power, and the guy that's in there now is this guy, what's his name, Poroshenko. So now Poroshenko is in there. But going back to that time, what was going on is that Ukraine was essentially in a bit of a civil war. Ukraine's divided between East and West. It's one country, but on the western side of Ukraine, they're pro-EU, pro-Western, and that type of thing. And the eastern part, they're basically Russians, and they are pro-Putin, pro-Russia. They want to be with Russia, not with the West. So this divides the country. And so Mr. Yanukovych, of course, was said to be, he's a puppet of Putin or what have you. And what was going on at that time was they were having a lot of issues, economic issues in Ukraine, and they were needing some kind of an economic bailout. So the EU was offering a bailout package, and the Russians were offering a bailout package. And Mr. Yanukovych chose to go with the Russian package, and that's why he had to go. Now, obviously, the package dealt with economic things, money, fuel, and things and such to help Ukraine with the difficulties they were having in the midst of this civil war that essentially was going on. Most of it fabricated by Soros and this Maidan group, along with his friends, the EU, the United States, Victoria Nuland, Victoria F.U. Nuland, F.the.EU. Nuland, and of course the Right Reverend Clinton, and all the other perps. So the economic package, in case you're not familiar with how this works in the EU, the plan in the EU from the very beginning all along was for the two powers, the major powers in the European Union, that would have been Germany and Great Britain, would have been for them to bring all these countries into the EU, and then knowing that all these countries in the EU, a lot of these countries were financially bankrupt and had a lot of problems, their plan was to make loans to all these small countries. They would mainly be backed by Germany and the UK. France is kind of a player, but they have the same debt issues as a lot of these other people, not really in a position to help much. They're kind of like on their own, kind of a second tier below Germany and the UK, but not much in a position to help, but not someone who they're going to try to take over, per se. Now, what the EU does is their program, and this was the program all along, to essentially give Germany and the UK complete ownership of all these countries in the EU, was to go to these poor countries like Greece and Spain and Italy and to say to them, your debt is out of control, you need an assistance package, you need help. And so they would do exactly what they did to Greece, which is get you to sign on to an economic package, loans that you could never repay. And then when you couldn't repay the loans, then the EU would come and exact their pound of flesh from you. You couldn't make the payment, so they would come and take assets and to compensate for the fact that you couldn't make your payments. Oh, you don't have the money to make your payment this month? We're going to take your railroad industry. Oh, you don't have your payment this month? We're going to take this industry, that industry. So that eventually, after 30, 40, 50 years of this, Germany and the UK would be sitting there owning all these countries in the EU. You see, it's a plot. And of course, now that the UK people voted to have Brexit, they want out of it, and that makes Germany throws a wrench into the whole spokes, because they really needed the help of the UK to pull this off. France isn't strong enough to do it. But of course, since the Brexit vote, that plot was foiled temporarily. But as you know, they're doing everything they can not to implement Brexit because of the overall long game plot that they had to take over all these European Union countries, which would eventually become split up between the UK and Germany, who would own all of them. This was the plan. But that's been foiled because of Brexit. We'll see how that turns out. So what happens is Yanukovych decides to go with the package offered to him by the Russians instead of the package offered to him by the EU. He also supports the Nord Stream pipeline, and he and the Russians have been talking about maybe another alternative pipeline to bring gas and oil into Eastern Europe by having a pipeline that maybe goes through Ukraine. So Mr. Yanukovych wins, and he has to be taken out. So they had the putsch, which was led by Mr. Soros, the European Union, and Victoria F. the EU Nuland, with under the guiding hand of the rotten Reverend Clinton and the Obama administration. Now, here's where it gets into the swamp. When the situation began to go bad in Ukraine, both sides, Mr. Yanukovych and Mr. Poroshenko and Yats, both sides began to hire lobbyists, Washington, D.C. American lobbyists, as well as lobbyists in other countries, I'm sure. And they hired lobbyists to represent them in the Congress, to the Obama administration, and to the Congress. And Mr. Manafort, it was his lobbying company that was contracted by Mr. Yanukovych to represent his side of things. And that put Mr. Manafort on the wrong side of the EU, on the Obama administration, the Soros, and all these players. Mr. Manafort got on the wrong side of the issue, siding with Mr. Yanukovych, who is now representing as a lobbyist in Washington. That is when a operative at the Democratic National Committee, whose name is one you've heard before, we've talked about her here before, her name is Alexandra Chalupa. That is a name we've heard before. We've talked about on TowerGate. Alexandra Chalupa is a Ukrainian American. She is a paid consultant operative by the Democratic National Committee, and she began researching Manafort and his ties to Ukraine and Russia to do him as much harm as possible, to hurt his efforts of lobbying on behalf of Mr. Yanukovych. So Chalupa begins feeding the narrative, and she begins working with government officials in the Ukraine. And Sharyl Attkisson lays out well over a dozen of major events that involved Ms. Chalupa, Ukrainian government officials, the Obama State Department, and others, including the media, to try as much as possible to dirty up Manafort, to hurt his efforts as much as possible. And so Ms. Chalupa began digging into Manafort, passing information which she was getting from the Ukrainian government, information to the Democratic National Committee, who was then feeding that information to media organizations in the U.S. and abroad to dirty up Manafort and show that he had these ties to Russia and Putin. This all culminated, and by the way, it wasn't just the State Department. The FBI and the CIA were also sucked into this, as well as it was being fed to them by the DNC. Excuse me. Okay. Now, this all culminated with a major event which occurred on April 12, 2016, when a member of the Ukrainian parliament, Olga Bielkova, met with John McCain, David Kramer, Liz Zentos, who's an Obama National Security Council, on the Obama National Security Council, as well as a State Department official named Michael Kimmage. And the Rotten Reverend Clinton also attended this meeting. So you had this Ukrainian parliament member, Olga Bielkova, meeting with McCain, Senator Magoo, David Kramer, Liz Zentos, Michael Kimmage, and the Rotten Reverend Clinton. There lays the origins of tying Manafort to Russians, who was then brought in shortly after that. In fact, about the same exact time as Trump brought Manafort in to help him with that delegate issue he was having, because the Republican Party was playing games with the delegates, trying to get those delegates to turn to Senator Cruz, Ted Cruz. And so they needed someone who understood the delegate process really well, who could come in and clamp down, shut it down, and keep the establishment Republican Party from stealing the delegates from Trump. And he was told, hey, the guy you need is Manafort. This guy knows how the game is played. He will come in and he will take care of business. And Trump did bring in Manafort, and he did take care of business, shut down the scam, and delivered those delegates and allowed Trump to become the Republican nominee. This all happened exactly at the time that culminated with this April 12th meeting in 2016. And this is where the origins are for laying the groundwork to tying Manafort to Russians. And they were also into Carter Page, deeply into Carter Page at the same time that they were into Manafort. And this is where they decided, oh, okay, so Trump's made Manafort his guy. Well, we've been doing all this research from the Ukrainian government, and here we can paint Manafort as a Putin tool or confidant connected to Trump, and therefore we can tie these guys together. And then once the DNC was hacked, so-called hacked, a couple of weeks later, 10 days later as a matter of fact, is when we were told that this occurred, they took that Trump-Russia narrative and they created it. Right there is your origins. This meeting that occurred was then leaked out to or the information about this meeting that took place was then given to Michael Isikoff of Yahoo, who's also the first guy who wrote an article suggesting that the Russians had some blackmail material on Trump. So Isikoff of Yahoo News published a story on Manafort's ties to Russian oligarchs. And that began the entire Russian narrative. Now, for a long time, we're trying to figure out where did David Kramer come from? We know he's connected to the Bushes. We know he's a neocon. We know he's a Russia-phobe. We know he is the head of the McCain Institute. We know he's got connections to all kinds of people in the State Department and the military-industrial complex. So we were trying to find how to connect David Kramer. Because remember, it was Kramer who lured McCain to that meeting in Nova Scotia, in Halifax, Nova Scotia, Canada, which is where he was first told about the dossier by Sir Andrew Wood. Sir Andrew Wood was contacted by Christopher Steele, called him on the phone and said, "Hey, we're setting something up. We need to get this dossier into the FBI, and a guy who hates Trump will be the perfect guy to be the one who can, and who also has a close relationship with Mr. Brennan and the CIA, and also with the FBI, will be a good guy to get the dossier, get into his hands, Senator Magoo." So we've set him up. We've got our good friend, David Kramer, who is going to take McCain to the Halifax International Conference, and it's there, Mr. Wood, that we would like you to go up to him and tell him about the dossier, and tell him how he can get a copy of it from me. And then Mr. Kramer is going to tell, once we've got McCain's interest, we're going to tell him that Mr. Kramer has got the go-ahead to get together with Mr. Steele in London, and Steele is going to give him the info, and he'll bring it back and give it to you, Mr. McCain. So this is how that scam was set up. So we now know how David Kramer was tied into this, and we know what his connections were to be a part of this, and how to get McCain into this, so that knowing good and well, as much as he hated Trump, as soon as this dossier, the word of it hit his ears, and as soon as the actual copy of it hit his hands, he was headed straight for Comey's office, and of course, a phone call to his good friend, Mr. Potato Head, John Brennan, who's right now contemplating a cyanide tablet in the bathtub, a bubble bath. So, that is the origins, and here is where David Kramer connects. David Kramer was a member of the anti-Russia group in Ukraine known as Ukraine Today. Ukraine Today is a media organization where David Kramer has input and where he appears on a regular basis. See, we would never know about this because we don't keep up with things going on in Ukraine, especially back in 2011, 2012, 2013. So this is how David Kramer ties into it. He was a member of the anti-Russia group Ukraine Today, which is essentially a media and propaganda organization. It was his ties, Kramer's ties, into this Ukrainian, anti-Russia Ukrainian group, which got him sucked into this group of people with Ms. Chalupa and these anti-Trump, anti-Putin Ukrainian politicians. And of course, the reason why the Ukrainian side didn't like Trump is because he had Flynn and himself talking about wanting to have a better relationship with Russia. Well, these Ukrainians, backed by the EU, the State Department, the Obama administration, and these Western Ukrainian politicians and members of parliament and all the rest, they saw Trump as a huge threat to them. Because, hey, if Trump and Flynn are friends of Mr. Yanukovych, and Mr. Manafort is their lobbyist working for them, if Trump becomes president, he is going to do things that favor Mr. Yanukovych and the Western Ukrainians, and we lose out. So this is why the Ukrainians, on the Eastern Ukrainians, worked with the State Department, the Obama administration, the EU, and all the rest to put together this coup plot or lay the origins for the coup plot was because Trump threatened their objective, their goals, their agenda. And Kramer was connected into this group because he got tied in, or he was tied in. He was part of this Ukraine Today group, media group, propaganda group that was obviously in cahoots with parliamentary people from Ukraine, as well as Miss Chalupa. And of course, this parliament member, Olga Bielkova, who became the point person to come over here to the U.S. and meet with Kramer, Senator Magoo, the Rotten Reverend Clinton, this person from Obama's National Security Council, and the State Department official, Mr. Kimmage. That is where they all got together, and that is the origins of the Trump-Russia fiasco. That's where it was laid, right there. And then from there, they took that, and then they used the release of the emails by WikiLeaks to build that into the narrative, and then the intelligence agencies and everyone else jumped on board. By which time, as this continued to move forward, and they got later into the year, and they saw that the polls by September were starting to close, Trump was gaining, Clinton was losing, they realized at that point that things might get a little dicey. And they realized at that point for the first time that Clinton could lose. So they had to come up with a plan. All this is all tied into this gigantic conspiracy, which, as Sharyl Attkisson lays out, began in 2011 with the Ukrainian issue, which served as the vehicle to carry the coup plot to where it is today. But now we're unraveling this plot, and they have failed. And as I said back in the very early days of my TowerGate videos, in the first 2 or 3, 4 or 5 TowerGate videos I did, I said, when Trump came out and said they tapped my wires, I said, if this is found to be true, a lot of people, dozens of very high-level people, are going to jail. Many dozens of very high-level people are going to jail. Many people have doubted that, and I understand why. But as I've laid out in other videos, nobody thought that the president would have to resign over a burglary gone bad. But it took down the president, the vice president, 2 attorney generals, chief of staff, the 2 White House lawyers, his entire team, the creep team, the people who ran the campaign to re-elect. 22 very high-level people went to prison in Watergate. That's why I know it is possible. It is possible. This is far worse than Watergate, much, much bigger conspiracy than Watergate. It involves a lot of things that Nixon could have only dreamed of, but never could do. The Obama administration did these things and much more. It's all right there. I'll provide the link for you so that you can go through this timeline if you like, to understand the origins of everything and how we got here. It's all coming undone. The game is up. The game is up. It's just a matter of time. Thank you so much for tuning in. Enjoy your day. Be back tomorrow. See you.